My parents spent my entire life telling people I was the daughter who would never amount to anything. Then my grandmother sent me a message with a code only the two of us understood. I stared at those 5 words on my phone until the screen went dark. Look beneath blue. That was all it said.
No explanation. No greeting. No signature.
But I knew exactly who it was from. My grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, had taught me that phrase when I was 8 years old, back when she was the only person in my family who believed I was worth listening to. She told me it was our little reminder that the truth was often hidden beneath what everyone else could see. I was Emily Carter, and for most of my life, I had been the person my family quietly apologized for. My parents never said the words directly in front of strangers, but I could feel it in the way they introduced me. My brother Michael was the successful one, the responsible one, the son who made them proud. I was the daughter who changed jobs too often, who took longer to find her direction, who never seemed to fit the perfect image they had created for our family. At every holiday dinner in our home in Ohio, I watched my father's smile grow wider when Michael talked about his career, while my own stories were met with polite nods and quick changes of subject. My mother always meant well, or at least that was what I told myself. "Emily, you just need to be more realistic," she would say. "Life doesn't work out for everyone the way they hope." I carried those words for years. They became a quiet voice in my own mind, making me question every decision I made. But my grandmother never saw me that way. When I visited her small house outside Columbus, she never asked me why I wasn't more like Michael. She asked what I was learning, what I was creating, what dreams I had not told anyone about. People mistake a quiet person for a weak person, she once told me while we sat at her kitchen table drinking tea. Never let them convince you that being different means being less. I thought about that memory as I looked again at the strange message on my phone. Grandma Margaret had never sent mysterious messages. She was the kind of person who called every Sunday afternoon and left handwritten notes inside birthday cards. So, why would she send me a secret code instead of simply calling me? My stomach tightened as I checked the time. The message had arrived at 2:13 in the morning. That was not like her. I immediately called her number, but there was no answer. I tried again. Nothing. A few minutes later, I called my mother. "Mom, have you talked to Grandma today?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to notice. "Why are you asking about your grandmother?" she replied. Her voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed, because she sent me something strange. Another silence. "Emily, you're probably overthinking it," she said finally. "Your grandmother is older. Sometimes people do things that don't make sense." I looked down at the message again. Look beneath blue. For the first time in my life, I wondered if the people who always told me I was imagining things were the same people who didn't want me to find the truth. I opened my closet and pulled out an old wooden box my grandmother had given me years ago. Inside were photographs, letters, and small memories from the woman who always saw something in me that nobody else did. Beneath the old birthday cards and faded pictures, I found a small blue envelope I had never noticed before. My hands froze, because written across the front, in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, were 4 words that made my heart race. For Emily, when needed. The blue envelope sat on my kitchen table for almost 10 minutes before I touched it again. I knew my grandmother's handwriting better than anyone. Every letter had the same careful curves, the same patience she carried into everything she did. She never rushed her words. She never wrote something without meaning behind it. I slowly opened the envelope and found a single piece of paper folded neatly inside. There were no long explanations. No emotional goodbye. Just one sentence written in black ink. "Emily, remember who believed in you when nobody else did." I read those words again and again because they brought back memories I had. spent years trying to push away. Growing up in the Carter family meant learning how to disappear in plain sight. I was not the child people celebrated. I was the child people worried about. When Michael brought home a scholarship letter in high school, my parents framed it and placed it in the living room where everyone could see it. When I graduated from college, my mother simply smiled and said, "At least you finished something." I remember standing there holding my diploma, waiting for the same excitement they had shown my brother. It never came. I was 22 years old, holding a piece of paper that represented years of effort, and somehow I still felt like I had disappointed everyone. Over time, I became used to lowering my expectations. I stopped sharing my plans because I already knew the responses I would receive. If I mentioned a new idea, my father would ask whether it was practical. If I talked about a goal, my mother would remind me to be careful. They were not cruel people. That was the hardest part. They believed they were protecting me. They believed they were helping me accept my limitations. But my grandmother saw something different. She saw the moments when I stayed late helping neighbors organize community events. She saw the patience I had when others needed someone to listen. She saw the things that did not appear on a resume or a bank statement. Emily, she once told me while we sat on her porch watching the sunset, some people only recognize success when it looks familiar to them. That does not mean your path is wrong. I held on to those words because they were the only ones that made me feel understood. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen with the blue envelope in front of me, I wondered why she had chosen this moment to remind me. My grandmother was 80 years old. She had always been independent, always organized, always prepared. If she wanted to tell me something important, there was a reason she could not simply say it. I looked back at the message on my phone. Look beneath blue. The phrase was not just a memory. It was a clue. I searched through the envelope again and found a small photograph hidden behind the paper. It showed my grandmother standing beside me when I was 12 years old. I was holding a small blue notebook she had given me. On the back of the photo, she had written a date and 3 words. The truth waits. My hands became still. For years, my family had told me that I was the one who misunderstood things, the one who overreacted, the one who needed to be more realistic. But now, for the first time, I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself to believe. What if I had not been the problem? What if there was a reason my grandmother had chosen me? I picked up my phone and called her again. This time, someone answered. But it was not my grandmother. It was my mother. "Emily," she said quietly. "Why are you calling so much?" I looked at the blue envelope, the photograph, and the message that started everything. Then I asked the question I should have asked years ago. "Mom, what happened to Grandma?" The silence that followed told me more than any answer could have. Something had changed, and I knew I could no longer pretend not to see it. My mother did not answer my question right away. The silence on the phone lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. I stood in my kitchen, holding the blue envelope in one hand and my phone in the other, waiting for an explanation that never came. "Emily, your grandmother is fine," my mother finally said. Her voice was calm, but something about it felt different. "She is just getting older. She needs more support now." I looked at the photograph sitting on the table. My grandmother standing beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. The same woman who always told me to trust my instincts. "Why did she send me this?" I asked. Another pause. "Send you what?" My mother's question was too quick, too careful. I noticed it immediately. "The envelope, Mom. The blue envelope from Grandma." I heard a small breath on the other end of the line. "Emily, I think you are making something bigger than it is." Those words were familiar. I had heard them my entire life. "You are imagining things. You are overthinking. You are too sensitive." For years, I accepted those words because they came from my parents. I believed that people who raised me must understand me better than I understood myself. But standing there in my quiet kitchen, I realized something important. My grandmother had spent my whole life teaching me not to ignore the small details. And there was one detail I could not ignore. My mother was avoiding my questions. The next morning, I drove to the assisted living community where my grandmother had supposedly been staying. It was about 25 minutes from my house, just outside a small town surrounded by quiet streets and tall oak trees. I had been there before, but only briefly. My parents always handled the visits. They always said they knew what was best. When I walked through the front doors, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I am here to see Margaret Whitmore." The woman typed something into her computer and looked back at me. "Margaret Whitmore?" she repeated. "Yes." Her expression changed slightly. "I am sorry, but Margaret has not had any visitors scheduled today." I felt confused. "I am her granddaughter." The receptionist nodded. "I understand. Let me check." After a moment, she looked up again. "Actually, Margaret has been asking about you." My heart skipped a beat. "She has?" "Yes," the woman said softly. "She asked if Emily Carter had come yet." I looked down at the floor for a second. My grandmother had been waiting for me. Not my father. Not my mother. Me. When I entered her room, I immediately noticed the small details. Her favorite blue blanket was folded neatly on the chair. A stack of books sat beside the window. Everything looked normal, but something felt different. My grandmother looked up from her chair and smiled when she saw me. "You found it," she said quietly. "I sat beside her." "Found what, Grandma?" She looked toward the door before answering. "The message." I nodded slowly. "Why did you send it?" She reached for my hand and held it gently. "Because I needed someone who would look for the truth instead of accepting the story everyone else was telling." Her words stayed with me. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but I could see the tiredness in her eyes. She had been carrying something for a long time. "Grandma, what is happening?" I whispered. She looked at me with the same calm expression she had when I was a child. "Emily, your family has spent years believing you were the least important person in the room." She paused and glanced at the blue envelope on the table. "That is exactly why you were the only person I could trust." My grandmother looked at me for a long moment before she spoke again. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of the clock on the wall. I had spent my entire life believing I was the person in my family who needed to prove herself. But sitting beside Margaret Whitmore that afternoon, I started to understand something I had never considered before. Maybe I was not the person who failed to see the truth. Maybe I was the person who had been taught not to look for it. "Emily," my grandmother said, "I need you to listen carefully. There are things your parents never wanted you to know." I felt my hands tighten around the edge of the chair. "About what?" I asked. She looked toward the window where the afternoon sunlight came through the curtains. "About the choices they made. About the way they have treated you. And about why I sent you that message instead of calling." I waited. My grandmother had always been careful with her words. She never spoke out of anger. She never rushed to judge anyone. That was what made her next words feel heavier. "Your parents have always underestimated you because they only measure people by what they can see immediately." She paused. "They see money, titles, achievements, things they can show other people." I looked down at my hands. I thought about every family gathering where I felt like an outsider in my own home. Every conversation where I stopped sharing because I already knew nobody would listen. "Grandma, what are you saying?" I asked. She reached toward the small table beside her chair and picked up a folder. It was thin and simple, with no label on the front. "I kept this because I knew one day you might need it." My heart started beating faster. Not from fear, but from the feeling that I was finally standing in front of a door that had been locked for years.
She opened the
folder and showed me several documents. I recognized my parents' names. I recognized my brother Michael's name. But I did not understand what I was looking at. Your parents always told you that you were irresponsible, my grandmother said. They told you that you were the one who needed help. But they never told you the full story. I looked at her. What story? She took a breath. The story of what happened after your grandfather passed away. I remembered that time. I was younger. Everyone in the family was grieving. My parents told me there were complicated matters they had to handle. I never questioned them. Why would I? They were my parents. When your grandfather passed, there were decisions made about the family assets, my grandmother explained. Some of those decisions were made without your knowledge. I looked at the papers again. The words seemed unfamiliar, but the names were clear. Why did nobody tell me? I asked. My grandmother gave me a sad smile. Because they thought you would not understand. They thought you were too trusting, too emotional, too inexperienced. The same words I had heard my whole life in different forms. But this time, they sounded different. They did not sound like descriptions of me. They sounded like excuses people used when they wanted to keep someone quiet. Grandma, why me? I asked softly. Why send this to me? She held my hand. Because you were the only one who still cared about what was right, not just what was convenient. I looked at the folder again. For years, I had believed my family saw me as weak because I lacked something. But now I wondered if they saw me as weak because they needed me to stay that way. My grandmother slowly closed the folder and pushed it toward me. There is more you need to know, Emily. But before you do anything, remember one thing. I looked at her.
What?
She smiled gently. Do not let people who misunderstood you convince you that you do not know your own worth. The folder stayed on my kitchen table that evening after I returned home from my grandmother's assisted living community. I did not open it again immediately. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my house and looked at the papers from a distance, almost as if they belonged to someone else. For years, I had been told that I was the one who could not handle complicated things. I was the one who needed explanations. I was the one who needed someone else to make decisions for me. But now I was holding documents my family had never wanted me to see. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood lights slowly turn on as the sun disappeared. Everything looked exactly the same. The same street, the same houses, the same peaceful evening. Yet somehow my entire understanding of my family had shifted. The next morning, I opened the folder carefully. Inside were copies of financial records, letters, and notes written in my grandmother's handwriting. She had organized everything with the same attention to detail she used when preparing holiday dinners. Every page had a date. Every document had a reason for being there. It was not random. It was not confusion from an older woman. My grandmother had been preparing for this moment. The first document I read was related to my grandfather's estate. I remembered when he passed away years earlier. My parents told me there were many responsibilities they had to manage. They said it was better if I stayed focused on my own life. At the time, I accepted that explanation. I thought they were protecting me from stress. But the document showed something I had never known. There were decisions made that affected the entire family, and my name was mentioned in places where I had never been included in the conversations. I felt a strange combination of sadness and clarity. The hardest part was not discovering that something had been hidden from me. The hardest part was realizing how easy it had been for everyone to convince me that I was not capable of understanding. My phone rang while I was reading. It was my brother, Michael. I stared at his name on the screen for a few seconds before answering. Emily, he said casually. Mom told me you went to see Grandma. I looked down at the papers in front of me.
Yes.
I did. There was a pause. She has been confused lately, Michael said. You know how Grandma is. She has always been dramatic about family things. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time someone in my family shared information I was not supposed to know, the first response was always the same. Make Emily doubt herself. Michael, I said calmly, why would Grandma send me a secret message if she was just confused? The silence on the phone was different this time. It was not uncertainty. It was hesitation. I do not know what you are talking about, he finally replied. But his answer came too quickly. After we ended the call, I returned to the folder. Near the bottom was a handwritten note from my grandmother. It was short. Emily, if you are reading this, do not confront anyone yet. Learn everything first. Truth is strongest when you understand it completely. I read those words several times. My grandmother knew me better than anyone. She knew I would want answers immediately. She knew I would want to ask why the people I loved had hidden things from me. But she was asking me to do something different. She was asking me to be patient. For the first time in my life, I decided not to rush to prove myself. I decided to listen. I decided to observe. And as I looked through the remaining documents, I realized the person my family underestimated the most was finally starting to see the entire picture. For the next few days, I did something I had never done before. I stopped trying to explain myself. I stopped trying to convince my family that I was capable. Instead, I watched. I listened. I paid attention to the small details I had ignored for years. My grandmother's advice stayed in my mind every morning when I woke up. Learn everything first. Truth is strongest when you understand it completely. So, I began with the documents she left behind. I created a simple timeline on my dining room table. Dates, names, decisions, conversations I remembered. At first, it looked like a collection of unrelated pieces. But slowly, those pieces started forming a picture that made me understand why my grandmother had been so careful. I contacted the attorney who had helped my grandfather with his estate years earlier. His name was Daniel Brooks. I had met him only once when I was younger, but I remembered his calm voice and the way my grandfather trusted him. When I called his office, I expected a difficult conversation. Instead, there was a moment of silence when I introduced myself. Emily Carter, he asked. I have been wondering when you would reach out. Those words immediately caught my attention. You were expecting me? I asked. Your grandmother told me there was a possibility you would contact me someday, he explained. She wanted to make sure you had someone who could answer your questions honestly. I sat quietly as he continued. Daniel explained that my grandmother had spent months organizing information. She had not done it because she wanted conflict. She had done it because she wanted clarity. That difference mattered. She was not trying to create a family argument. She was trying to make sure I had the opportunity to understand what had happened. After our conversation, I met with him at a small coffee shop near his office. He brought copies of records that helped explain the situation. As I looked through them, I noticed something that surprised me. My grandmother had not focused on protecting herself. She had focused on protecting me. She knew exactly how my family viewed me. She knew they saw me as the person least likely to question anything. The person who would accept whatever explanation they gave. The person who would quietly step aside. And for a long time, they were right. I thought about every time my parents had made decisions for me without asking what I wanted. Every time they said, "We are only doing this because we know what is best." I used to hear those words as love. Now I wondered if they were also a way of keeping control. When I returned home that evening, I received a message from my mother. We need to talk about Grandma. She has been saying things that are causing unnecessary stress. I stared at the message for a while. A few months earlier, I would have immediately apologized. I would have asked what I had done wrong. I would have tried to fix the situation before I even understood it. But something had changed. I simply replied, "I agree. We do need to talk. I just want everyone to be honest." A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded different from usual. "Emily, your grandmother has always had strong opinions. You should be careful about letting one conversation change how you see your family." I looked around my quiet house. The same house where I had spent years questioning my own value. The same house where I had learned to stay silent. Then I looked at the folder on my table. The truth was no longer something hidden in the background. It was something I could see clearly. "Dad," I said calmly, "I am not changing how I see my family because of one conversation. I am changing because I finally started listening." After I ended the call, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not sadness. Something much stronger. Confidence. For years, they had believed I was the easiest person to overlook. They never imagined that being overlooked meant I had been paying attention all along. The following morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For years, mornings had always felt like a race to prove I was keeping up with everyone else. I would check my phone, answer messages, and prepare myself for another day of trying to be understood. But that morning was different. I sat by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and allowed myself to think clearly. I was no longer trying to convince my family that I deserved to be heard. I was preparing to show them that I already had been listening. I spent the next few days carefully reviewing everything Daniel Brooks had given me. Each document added another piece to the story. The more I learned, the more I understood why my grandmother had chosen patience over confrontation. She knew emotions could make people careless. She knew the truth needed to stand on its own. One of the documents caught my attention more than the others. It was a letter written by my grandmother several months earlier. It was not addressed to anyone. It was simply a personal note she had kept with her records. "People often reveal what they believe about you by the way they treat your voice," she had written. "If they never ask what you think, they have already decided your opinion does not matter." I read that sentence several times. It explained something I had felt my entire life, but never had the words to describe. My family did not just underestimate my abilities. They underestimated my awareness. They believed because I was quiet, I was unaware. Because I was patient, I was weak. Because I avoided arguments, I had nothing important to say. That afternoon, I visited my grandmother again. She looked happier when she saw me walk through the door. "You look different," she said with a small smile. I sat beside her and laughed softly. "Different how?" She looked at me carefully, like someone who finally stopped asking permission to trust herself. Her words stayed with me. I told her about my conversation with Daniel. I told her I was beginning to understand why she had waited. She nodded slowly. "Your parents are not used to you asking questions, Emily. For a long time, they were comfortable with the version of you they created." I looked at her. "The version where I was the problem?" She sighed gently. "The version where they never had to admit they were wrong." That was the hardest truth to accept. Not because it was painful, but because it explained so many moments from my past. The times I felt invisible. The times my opinions were dismissed before I finished speaking. The times I was told I was being unrealistic when I was simply seeing things differently. Before I left, my grandmother handed me another envelope. This one was smaller. "Not yet," she said when I reached for it. I looked at her with curiosity. "Why not?" "Because the next part requires more than knowing the truth. It requires knowing what you want to do with it." I held the envelope in my hands, but did not open it. For the first time, I understood that this was not about proving my family wrong. It was about understanding myself. When I arrived home that evening, I found a message from Michael waiting for me. We need to meet. Mom and Dad are worried about what Grandma may have told you. I looked at the words on the screen. Before, that message would have made me nervous. I would have wondered if I had done something wrong. But now I noticed something else. They were not asking if I was okay. They were not asking what Grandma needed. They were worried about what I knew. I placed my phone on the table and looked at the unopened envelope beside it. For years, I had believed my family held all the answers, and I was the one searching for approval. Now I realized something had changed. The questions were no longer mine alone, and soon they would have to answer some of their own. The unopened envelope stayed on my desk for 2 days. I carried it from room to room without opening it, almost as if I was waiting for the right moment. In the past, I would have opened it immediately. I would have searched for answers because I was desperate to understand why things happened the way they did. But my grandmother had taught me something important. Information was only powerful when you were prepared to handle it. So I waited. I continued gathering everything I could. I spoke with Daniel Brooks again. I reviewed the documents my grandmother had saved. I wrote down questions instead of assumptions. For the first time in my life, I was not reacting to what my family said. I was making decisions based on what I knew. Finally, on Sunday afternoon, I opened the small envelope. Inside was another handwritten note from my grandmother. There was no anger in her words.
No bitterness.
Just the same calm wisdom she had always carried. Emily, there will come a moment when people who underestimated you realize they were wrong. Do not use that moment to hurt them. Use it to understand yourself. Beneath the note was a name and a phone number. It belonged to someone I had never met. A woman named Laura Bennett. Daniel explained later that Laura had worked with my grandfather years ago and had been aware of some family matters. I called her that afternoon. When she answered, she immediately knew who I was. Emily Carter, she said. Your grandmother told me you might call one day. I closed my eyes for a moment. Everyone seemed to know something except me. Can you tell me what happened? I asked. Laura was quiet before responding. I can tell you what I saw, but I want you to understand something first. Your grandmother never wanted revenge. She only wanted you to have the truth. That sentence meant more to me than she probably realized. For so long, I had imagined this moment as a confrontation. I imagined asking my family why they treated me like I was incapable, why they made decisions without me, why they believed I had nothing valuable to contribute. But as I listened to Laura speak, I realized this was not about winning an argument. It was about seeing the complete picture. Laura explained that after my grandfather passed away, my grandmother noticed changes in how information was shared within the family. Certain decisions were discussed without everyone being included. Some family members were given more access and more influence than others. Your grandmother noticed that you were always left out, Laura said. But she also noticed something else. What was that? I asked. She noticed you were the only person who never asked for anything. I looked around my quiet living room. That was true. I never expected special treatment. I never asked my parents for more attention. I never wanted anyone to feel pressured to choose me over my brother. I simply wanted to be seen. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time. I thought about the person I had been for years. The daughter who stayed quiet because she thought speaking up would create problems. The person who accepted being underestimated because she believed family knew best. Then I thought about my grandmother. She never saw me as someone who needed to be rescued. She saw me as someone who needed to remember her own strength. The next morning I called my parents, asked them to meet me at a quiet restaurant near my house. Not because I wanted an argument. Not because I wanted apologies. I simply wanted honesty. When they arrived, my mother looked nervous. My father looked serious. Michael came with them. They sat across from me, expecting the same Emily they had always known. The Emily who apologized first. The Emily who avoided difficult conversations. The Emily who accepted whatever explanation she was given. But when I placed the folder on the table between us, I saw something change in their expressions. For the first time, they realized I was no longer asking for permission to understand my own life. The restaurant was quiet when my family arrived. It was the kind of place my grandmother would have liked. Simple.
Warm.
A place where people could talk without feeling rushed. I chose it because I did not want a dramatic setting. I did not want raised voices or an audience. I only wanted the truth to have a place to sit at the table with us. My parents walked in first. My father looked the same as always, confident and composed. My mother carried the same careful expression she used whenever she wanted to avoid a difficult conversation. Michael followed behind them, looking at his phone until he sat down. For a moment, I saw the old version of myself sitting there. The daughter who would have immediately tried to make everyone comfortable. The daughter who would have apologized for creating tension. But that version of me was slowly becoming someone I no longer recognized. I placed the folder on the table. Nobody touched it. Nobody asked what was inside. That silence told me more than any explanation could. "I think we need to talk honestly," I said. My mother looked at me. "Emily, we do not understand why you are making this such a big issue." I took a slow breath. That is exactly the problem. For years, everyone else decided what was important enough for me to know. My father leaned back in his chair. "Your grandmother has always been emotional about family matters." I looked at him calmly. "Dad, you always told me I was too emotional. But now I am sitting here with documents, dates, and conversations. I am not here because of feelings. I am here because I finally have information." The table became quiet. Michael looked uncomfortable. I opened the folder and placed several papers in front of them. I did not push them across the table. I did not demand answers. I simply let them see what I had found. My mother looked down first. Her expression changed slightly. My father picked up one of the documents and read it carefully. "Where did you get these?" he asked. It was the first question he asked me that did not sound like he was trying to correct me. "Grandma gave them to me," I answered, "because she trusted me." Those words seemed to affect them more than the documents themselves. My entire life, my family had treated trust as something I had to earn, but my grandmother had given it to me freely. Michael finally spoke. "Emily, you need to understand. Things are complicated. You do not know everything that happened." I looked at him. "You are right. I do not know everything. That is why I am asking now." It was a simple sentence, but it felt powerful. I was no longer defending myself. I was asking for the respect of being included. My father looked away for a moment. "We thought we were helping you," he said quietly. I nodded. "I know you believe that. But helping someone does not mean making every decision for them." Nobody answered. The conversation continued for more than an hour. There were explanations. There were uncomfortable pauses. There were moments when my parents tried to explain why they had made certain choices. I listened carefully. I did not interrupt. I did not need to. The difference between that day and every other conversation we had ever had was simple. Before, they spoke and I accepted. This time, they spoke and I understood. When we finally left the restaurant, I felt something I never expected. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel like I had defeated anyone. I simply felt lighter. For years, I carried the belief that something was wrong with me because my family did not see my value. But standing outside that restaurant, I realized the truth. My worth had never depended on whether they recognized it. My grandmother had known who I was all along. And now, finally, I knew it too.